We're going to begin our discussion on subtext with subtext. There goes Roe again, stating the obvious. Well, it's worth mentioning that the word subtext can stand in for several things that have to do with the meaning between the lines in the story. It can refer to the larger subtext of the work, the real meaning behind the story. Those are larger questions than what we'll be starting with here. Sometimes subtext is smaller. That's what we'll be wrestling with today, a manageably sized opponent. American writers of literary fiction have an oversized love of this kind of subtext, in my opinion. Perhaps it's a legacy handed down from Hemingway. Perhaps it's just that leaving things half-spoken or even unspoken leaves the reader in the position of pondering the story more deeply. To me, it seems a bit like the epiphany in early to mid-20th century short stories. A literary story just didn't seem complete without one. But sometimes epiphanies don't happen, especially in real life. And, similarly, quite often, people talk to each other without talking past each other. Sometimes people are quite direct, and this too can be dramatic, deep, and meaningful. So what am I going on about? Here's a glossary definition of subtext from a popular fiction writing book. Quote, meaning that is implied rather than stated. All text has a subtext, the meaning that lies beneath the actual words, end quote. The idea that all text has a subtext, I'd say, is a bit hyperbolic. If we're talking about a narrator describing a scene and a narrator says something like, there was a sofa and 2 chairs in the living room, I think you can generally take it at face value. Now one might make the case that the fact that the character has a sofa and 2 chairs in her living room conveys information about her, like that she's got enough money for a sofa, 2 chairs, and a living room for that matter. Fair enough, I guess. But I'm not so certain that thinking that far between the lines does all that much good for a writer. You can send yourself into a tailspin pretty fast trying to get at the deeper meaning and the meaning behind that meaning, when you probably don't need to go much deeper than, she had a sofa and 2 chairs. Great, no big deal. Means she needs to sit down from time to time, and occasionally she might have guests over. Of course there's more information there that could be inferred, but is it serving us writers well, or is it getting in our way? So too with subtext when characters speak to one another. If Lily says to Derek, I love you so much, can't she just mean it? I love you so much. And can't that be dramatic in the context of a love story? I think some fiction writers, especially literary writers, would say no, that there always must be more bubbling beneath the surface, or there should be. I'm not so sure. I'm of the Freud school here. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and that's fine. What I think writers should do is get a sense for when people use subtext in conversation, why they use it, and how it can be dramatic. One way to think about subtext in a conversation is as the little lies we tell each other, because sometimes as social creatures, we need to be polite for many different reasons. Gretchen hates Liza because her husband Thomas had a fling with Liza when they were first dating 10 years ago. Now their daughters are in the same class at school. When they bump into each other at the school play, Gretchen's probably going to say something like, Hi Liza, it's so nice to see you, and both she and Liza are going to know better. But Liza's still probably going to say, Oh, thank you, you too, Gretchen, you look so great. And we do this because it's a lot better than hurling obscenities across the room while the kids are just trying to recite their lines in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory without vomiting on stage or passing out in front of 200 people. All the little lies we tell each other have social meaning. In this case, I care more about supporting my child's current endeavors than my old grudge with you, Liza. Fake smile. All people engage in psychological games and dishonest behavior to help make potentially uncomfortable social situations more bearable for themselves or others, even if it's just by biting their tongues occasionally. Steven Pinker explores this curious and understudied aspect of human behavior in his 2008 book, The Stuff of Thought, under the chapter heading Games People Play. He highlights how speaking indirectly can often lead to a higher likelihood of attaining a desired outcome in certain circumstances. One example he gives is of the classic line at the end of a date. Jalen says to Rika, Do you want to come up for coffee? Now, it's probably late in the night, and neither of them really wants coffee, and both of them probably know the other doesn't want coffee. Jalen's asking Rika if she wants to have sex with him, so why not just ask her directly? Pinker points out that couching the real question subtextually behind a more innocuous question is the smart move both statistically and socially. If Jalen says nothing at the end of this date, he's almost guaranteed to get no sex. If he says, "Would you like to come up and have sex with me, Rika?" she may say yes. But the directness of the question makes a yes less likely, and it also increases the chance of a negative rebuke. Coffee, on the other hand, Pinker points out, is much easier for Rika to agree to, and if she doesn't think it's a good idea, there's little chance of a harsh rebuke. She can say something like, "Oh, no thanks, it's been a nice night, Jalen, but if I have coffee now, I'll never get to sleep, but you should call me." And nobody's ego has been destroyed. Or she might just say, "All right." This is one reason we use subtext. Sometimes the direct approach isn't the best move. There are quite a few other reasons we wouldn't realistically be direct with each other. Most of these circumstances occur when the risk of being direct is greater than the payoff of being indirect or ignoring the truth. Some of these circumstances might be telling white lies to save another's feelings, compromising principles for social acceptance, ignoring the elephant in the room, failing to address what you know will hurt, testing an adversary's boundaries, insulting someone indirectly, hiding one's true motives, or outright deceit. All of these are realistic circumstances where a person might say one thing and mean another. Sometimes dialogues like these can be imbued with highly dramatic subtext of the type literary writers go crazy for. Let's explore a pair of examples where a subtext plays a major role in a dialogue. The first is from Rick Bass's short story Fires, where the narrator, Joe, a Montana woodsman, is falling in love with Glenda, a runner who has come up to his high-altitude area to train for the summer. Both Joe and Glenda are drawn to each other and would often talk to each other on a two-way radio late at night. "Have you seen the hedgehog?" she would ask, sleepily, but it would only be a radio that was in the dark house with me, not her real voice. "Did you see the hedgehog?" she'd want to know. And I'd wish she were staying with me. I'd wish she were with me at the moment. But it would be no good. Glenda was leaving in August or September at the latest. "No," I'd say, "no hedgehog today. Maybe it's gone away," I'd say. "How are the dogs?" she'd ask. "How are Homer and Ann?" "They're asleep." "Good night," she'd say. "Good night," I'd say. Joe and Glenda are engaging in the classic act of ignoring the elephant in the room here. They both desperately want the other to just make a move. And if you look at the dialogue itself, it's so mundane. How are the dogs? Well, they're asleep. Have you seen the hedgehog? But because the conversation is imbued with this other layer, the two potential lovers holding back, the mundane dialogue is wrought with suspense. Will he say something? Will she say something? Will they? Won't they? Part of the reason it comes across so clearly in the dialogue is that the circumstances are clearly conveyed by the narrator. He tells it straight. "I'd wish she were staying with me. I'd wish she were with me at the moment, but it would be no good." Then, when the reader gets to the back and forth about the dogs, it's very clear they're not just talking about the dogs. This is the kind of dramatic tension that subtext can convey when it's realistically portrayed. Here's another classic example of subtext being employed to convey a deeper meaning. In Edgar Allan Poe's short story The Cask of Amontillado, the narrator, Montresor, is bent on revenge against his rival Fortunato for insults against the Montresor family name. Montresor meets him at the festival, and then this happens. "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of the carnival!" "I have my doubts," I replied. "And I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain. Amontillado? I have my doubts. Amontillado! And I must satisfy them. Amontillado! As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucrezi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me. Lucrezi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go." "Whither?" "To your vaults." "My friend, no, I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lucrece! I have no engagement. Come. My friend, no, it is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre. Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado! You have been imposed upon. And as for Lucrece, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado. The reader can infer from this encounter that Montresor is using Fortunato's ego against him. It's the kind of cagey malevolence that you might see in Shakespeare. There are fools out there who think Lucrece is as good as you, my friend. But you are so busy, so... Montresor knows Fortunato's ego won't let this kind of prick to it stand. And off to the catacombs they go. And Fortunato thinks it's his idea. Again, the subtext is clear to the reader here. I suspect this is a point that is often overlooked when discussing subtext. The reader understands how to read Montresor's dialogue because he states so clearly at the outset that he's bent on revenge. He really wants to get this guy. The story opens like this. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. Thus, when he meets Fortunato in the street, the reader knows that when he treats Fortunato with feigned good spirits, he's clearly being deceptive. The reader knows to look for some ill intent, though they may not know what Montresor's exact intentions are. They're clearly not good, though, and that makes the subtext all the more apparent from the outset. So, what can we conclude about subtext based on this brief discussion? A few things, I think. The first is that we shouldn't take the idea that there's a subtext to everything literally. Of course, there will always be more information underlying every situation than can make it onto the page. This is a product of both the complexity of life and the limitation of a symbolic art form. The sign will always be less complex than the signifier, and not every conversation has a deeper underlying meaning to be decoded. Nor is a conversation that has a clear subtext necessarily any more profound than one that lacks any interpretable subtext. But people play games, and sometimes this can be a wonderful chance to build drama. Subtext is often a very effective tool in the fiction writer's arsenal, yet the subtext should be clear to the reader so they stand a chance of interpreting the situation correctly. If Montresor doesn't signal his intention for revenge, or Joe doesn't make it clear that he deeply wishes to be with Glenda, then the reader reads Montresor's overture as a friendly, flattering encounter, and Joe and Glenda's radio conversation is just a totally boring, meaningless bit of small talk about dogs and hedgehogs. When characters speak past their true intentions, the reader should know it, and at least be able to guess why. Just like in real life, though, every fictional conversation can't have deeper layers to it. So when can writers realistically lay on the subtext and generate real tension in the process? It should fit the reality of both the character's motivation and the plot situation. This could happen in any time a reasonable person would withhold information or couch their true intentions behind a front to a purpose. It might be the type of game that Steven Pinker explains as a feature of human behavior, to increase the chances of a character getting what they want while decreasing the chances of a terrible outcome. It could also be outright deceit, like Montresor, or it could be a character being too vulnerable or emotionally distant to open up and risk getting hurt, like Joe. In any case, it's worth thinking about subtext in a dialogue as a tool, to be used to a purpose and with discretion. This means that overemphasizing the importance of subtext in fiction can lead to bad writing. A writer could easily steer their reader down the wrong path by trying to manufacture tension in an otherwise mundane interaction, which a reader would probably just read as being totally boring or confusing. Forcing subtext on a situation is not a good move when the actual dialogue will suffer as a result. And in those times when characters are talking and they'd realistically be direct, let them be direct. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Reading is hard enough. We can't realistically expect the reader to be excavating layer upon layer of inscrutable meaning ad infinitum. Not if we want them to stick around long enough to even consider the story meaningful. Tell a good story well, and the rest will take care of itself.